Admiral Kareth stood in the observation chamber of the Valorian command vessel, watching the star system collapse into chaos below. The Zarathi armada had arrived without warning, their weapons tearing through the fragile peace that had existed for over 3 centuries. His secondary eyes tracked the flight paths of dying ships, calculating survival probabilities that grew smaller with each passing moment. The numbers were bleak. The Valorians had fought bravely, but they were scientists and traders, not warriors. The Terran Collective was their last hope, though hope seemed like a generous word for the situation. The humans had been contacted only 6 months ago when Kareth's people first emerged into the Galactic community. They were young, unpredictable, and possessed a military philosophy that made most civilized species uncomfortable. Yet they had weapons. They had speed. They had something else too, something Kareth had read about in the preliminary reports. They had courage that bordered on recklessness. A communications officer approached him, his 3-fingered hands trembling as he extended a data pad. The information displayed was in the Universal Protocol, but the name at the top was decidedly human. Captain Marcus Webb. The vessel was designated UTHSS Intrepid, a destroyer-class warship of the human Terran fleet. Kareth read the transmission once more, his translator converting the rapid human speech into his native language. "We are en route. Your distress beacon reached us 4 hours ago. We are accelerating to maximum velocity. Estimated arrival time, 11 hours 23 minutes. Do not surrender. 11 hours might as well be an eternity." The Zarathi would finish their conquest well before then, reducing the Valorian civilization to ash and servitude. Kareth had run the probabilities 1,000 times. With the current bombardment rate, his people would have perhaps 3 hours before critical infrastructure failed completely. After that, organized resistance became impossible. After that, the remaining survivors would be scattered refugees hunted across a dozen planets. But the humans had said not to surrender. Kareth had learned enough about human culture in the past 6 months to understand that such words were not spoken lightly. When a human warrior made a promise, they kept it, even if it meant sacrificing everything in the attempt. Even if it meant losing their own lives in a fight they had only just been made aware of. He turned to his tactical officer, a female named Shalia whose tactical expertise had kept them alive this long. Her upper body was covered in defensive plating and her lower limbs bore the scars of combat. She looked at him with all 4 of her eyes, waiting for his command. "Send word to all surviving defense stations. We shift to a holding pattern. Buy time. Every minute we survive increases the likelihood that the human vessel will arrive. Tell them we are not fighting for victory anymore. We are fighting for dawn." Across the system, the Valorian forces adjusted their tactics. They stopped attempting to push back the Zarathi invaders and instead focused on sustaining their positions. It was a change in philosophy that took courage, because it meant accepting that defense was all that remained. It meant hoping that creatures from a world they had barely heard of would cross the vast distances of space to save them. It meant placing their entire future in the hands of a species barely known to them. The human response was so different from anything in Valorian military doctrine that Admiral Kareth found it difficult to comprehend. Rather than sending a large fleet, the Terrans sent a single destroyer. Rather than coordinating a complex strategy, Captain Marcus Webb simply transmitted a heading and a velocity. And rather than requesting additional reinforcement or suggesting a staged approach to the problem, the human captain was doing something far stranger. He was pushing his ship to speeds that conventional engineering said were unsafe. Kareth studied the human's profile that came through the communications array. The image showed a bipedal creature with tan skin and dark hair, his face angular and focused. His eyes held something that Kareth had never quite seen in any diplomat or scientist, but had read about in human literature. Determination. Not the cold calculation of survival that drove most sapient beings, but something deeper. Something that suggested he had made a choice and would see it through regardless of personal cost. The Zarathi commander, a monstrous being named Krell whose species had evolved in a binary star system, sent a message demanding immediate surrender. The The Valorians refused. The bombardment intensified. 3 defense stations fell, then another. Kareth moved his command vessel twice, each time narrowly escaping the Zarathi interdiction fire. His people were dying, but they were holding. The Intrepid was still 17 hours away. Then something changed. The human ship's beacon suddenly shifted. It appeared on Kareth's tactical display in an entirely different location, having somehow covered a distance that should have required 6 more hours of travel. Kareth checked the readings twice. The mathematics was impossible. No ship engine operated with that kind of efficiency. No crew could withstand those acceleration forces. Yet there it was, reducing the distance between salvation and obliteration with each passing second. A new message came from the Intrepid, this one directed at the Zarathi commander. The human's tone was entirely different from the careful diplomat that most galactic beings expected. There was no negotiation in it, no attempt at persuasion. There was only statement. This is Captain Marcus Webb of the UTHSS Intrepid. Stand down your weapons and withdraw from this system. You have 30 minutes to comply. After that, we will make your compliance mandatory. Krell responded with laughter that translated as pure contempt. A single human destroyer against a Zarathi armada. It was absurdity. It was the final desperate gesture of a species that did not understand its own limitations. The Zarathi commander continued the bombardment with redoubled intensity, clearly intending to finish the Valorians before this upstart human vessel could even enter the combat zone. Admiral Kareth watched the chronometer. 28 minutes remained. The Intrepid would not arrive in time to prevent the complete collapse of Valorian defenses. Their sole chance was that the human captain had something in mind that went beyond simple attrition warfare. He had to believe that. The alternative was that his entire civilization was about to be extinguished by an ancient enemy that had hunted them for generations. The 30-minute countdown reached 0. For a moment, nothing happened. The Zarathi bombardment continued. The defense stations continued to fall. Kareth felt the weight of despair settling over him like a shroud. The humans had miscalculated. They thought they could reach the system before the Valorians were destroyed, but they had been wrong. They had been too slow. They had failed. Then the darkness lit up. Space itself seemed to tear apart as the Intrepid dropped out of fast drive directly into the heart of the Zarathi armada. The human destroyer was smaller than Kareth expected, barely a quarter of the mass of the largest Zarathi cruiser. But what it lacked in size it compensated for with something that made Kareth's translator hesitate: raw, explosive fury. Weapons fire erupted from the human vessel in a pattern that had nothing to do with the careful, calculated tactics of civilized warfare. The Intrepid's primary cannon discharged in rapid succession, each shot striking with the kind of precision that suggested Captain Webb had done something no human should have been able to do. He had calculated attack vectors through a system he had never seen, through an armada whose positions were constantly shifting, and had threaded his ship through the gaps while firing weapons that most species would have needed minutes to calibrate. A Zarathi patrol ship exploded. Then another. The human captain was not engaging in a traditional battle formation. Instead, he was weaving between the Zarathi vessels with a kind of supernatural grace, striking where the enemy was weakest, moving before the return fire could properly target him. It was the tactic of someone who understood that a small force fighting a large one did not engage in straightforward combat. A small force became a wraith, appearing and disappearing, striking at critical points while the larger opponent flailed at empty space. Krell immediately redirected his fleet, pulling his vessels away from the dying Valorian defense stations and converging on the single human ship. It was a tactical mistake, and Kareth realized that the Zarathi commander had made it deliberately. The anger and pride of a warrior species had overridden logical calculation. They could not allow a single destroyer to inflict such casualties on their fleet without responding with overwhelming force. The Intrepid was surrounded. 3 cruisers were closing in from different vectors, and supporting frigates were moving to cut off the human vessel's escape route. Kareth expected Captain Webb to attempt a retreat, to use that incredible speed to distance himself from the converging threat. Instead, The human destroyer accelerated directly toward the center of the converging Zarathi formation. Karath had no word in his language for the kind of courage that drove such an action. Bravery, yes. Recklessness, certainly. But there was something else, something that human philosophers must have explored in their brief time as a spacefaring species. It was the willingness to trade personal safety for the safety of others. It was fighting not for victory, but for the smallest chance that those you had sworn to protect might live to see tomorrow. The human weapon sang. Every gun battery on the Intrepid fired simultaneously as Captain Webb drove his ship between two of the converging Zarathi cruisers. The smaller vessel's shields flared white with the energy of weapons fire, buckling under the assault. Karath watched the shield projectors beginning to fail, saw the hull integrity dropping with each exchange of fire. And then, impossibly, a human voice came through the communications array. It was Captain Marcus Webb, speaking directly to Admiral Karath. Despite everything happening around him, the destruction of his ship drawing closer with each moment, the human's voice was steady and clear. Admiral, I am holding the Zarathi converging force here. You need to rally your surviving forces and strike at their rear formations. The Intrepid cannot hold this position indefinitely. I estimate I have approximately 10 minutes before my shields fail completely. Use those 10 minutes. Do not waste them honoring the fallen. The fallen need you to survive. Karath found himself moving before he had consciously made the decision to do so. He barked orders at his tactical officer. Every remaining defense platform, every intact warship, every fighter craft still capable of flight. They were going to strike at the Zarathi rear formations while the Intrepid held the converging fleet. It was a plan with no guarantee of success, but it was a chance. In the darkness, it was the only light that remained. The Valorian forces launched with the kind of desperation that only comes when a species understands it is fighting for the right to exist. As they moved, Karath kept one sensor array locked on the Intrepid. The human destroyer was taking tremendous damage. Its shield generators were failing systematically. Hull sections were venting atmosphere. In any conventional war, the ship should have already been destroyed multiple times over. But Captain Marcus Webb was doing something else. With each catastrophic failure, he repositioned his ship, using the momentum of his vessel and the destructive patterns of the converging Zarathi fire to keep his ship in the most protected positions. It was a dance with death, and the human captain was leading with absolute precision. Karath realized that the man had not planned to hold the converging force indefinitely. He had planned to use them, to turn their overwhelming fire against themselves, to force them to damage each other while he danced between their strikes. The Valorian counteroffensive struck at the Zarathi rear formations like a comet, sudden and devastating. The Zarathi fleet was designed for overwhelming force from a single direction, not for a coordinated assault from multiple vectors. The rear formation began to collapse. Ships that should have been safe became targets. Command structures that should have been secure were threatened. Krell realized the tactical situation was deteriorating. He sent an emergency transmission to his fleet, ordering a withdrawal. The Zarathi commander had come for conquest, confident in his ability to crush the young Valorian civilization. He had not anticipated the arrival of the humans. He had not anticipated the kind of tactical brilliance that Captain Marcus Webb had demonstrated. Most of all, he had not anticipated that a single destroyer would be willing to sacrifice itself to protect a people it had only just learned existed. As the Zarathi fleet began its retreat, Admiral Karath ordered his forces to cease fire. The Valorians were too damaged to pursue, and they all understood now that they had already achieved what seemed impossible just hours before. They had survived. Their civilization would continue. The darkness that had threatened to consume them had passed. But the Intrepid was dying. Karath could see it on his tactical display, the human destroyer's power systems failing, its structural integrity collapsing under the accumulated damage it had sustained. The ship had given everything to buy those 10 minutes. It had given everything to make the impossible possible. Karath immediately diverted all of his remaining medical vessels and support ships toward the human destroyer. They would reach the Intrepid in minutes. It was all they could do. The communication array crackled with static, and then Captain Marcus Webb's voice came through again. He sounded weaker now, but the determination had not left him. "Admiral Karath, the Zarathi are withdrawing. Your fleet is intact. Your people will survive this day. Tell them that humanity stands with the Valorian people. Tell them that no friend of the Terran Collective will ever be left to face darkness alone." The human captain did not ask if his ship would survive. He did not ask if his crew would make it through the night. He asked only that the message be carried forward, that the Valorians understand that they were not alone in the galaxy anymore, that somewhere among the stars there was a species young and wild and willing to bleed for those they called allies. The Valorian rescue vessels reached the Intrepid just as the human destroyer's final systems began to fail. What they found shocked them. The ship was barely more than a wreck, held together by force fields and will alone. The majority of the hull was exposed to vacuum. The reactors were offline. Of the original crew of 200, only 37 remained alive, but Captain Marcus Webb was among them. As the Valorian rescue teams brought him aboard their medical vessel, the human looked directly at Admiral Karath through the communication feed. His uniform was torn. His left arm was wrapped in emergency medical tape. There was blood on his face and more on his hands. "Admiral, I apologize that I could not prevent more casualties. My crew performed beyond every expectation, but the damage was unavoidable. In the Terran philosophy of war, we accept the cost of protecting those unable to protect themselves. We accept that the strong must sometimes sacrifice so that the weak might survive. This is not a burden we resent. It is a sacred duty." Admiral Karath had no response that seemed adequate. What could he say to a man who had arrived in the darkness and become a light? What words could encompass the gratitude of an entire civilization that had been pulled back from the brink of extinction? He simply inclined his head, which among the Valorians was a gesture that meant more than any words could convey. It meant respect. It meant honor. It meant the beginning of something new. The Valorian system was badly damaged. Hundreds of thousands had been killed. Entire cities had been reduced to ruins. But the people remained. The culture remained. The future remained. Over the following months, as the Valorians began the long process of rebuilding, they came to understand more about the human species. They learned that Earth had been united for only a few short decades before launching its expansion into space. They learned that humans had faced their own extinction events, their own moments of darkness where the future seemed uncertain. And they learned that something in the human spirit, something that most older civilizations had lost long ago, drove them to face those moments not with resignation, but with defiance. Captain Marcus Webb became a legend among the Valorian people. A statue was erected in the primary city, depicting the human in his captain's uniform, one hand extended as if reaching across the darkness to those in need. When young Valorians asked their elders who the statue represented, they told the story. They told of the darkness, and of a human who had emerged from that darkness with weapons blazing, willing to face overwhelming odds because a people he had barely known had called for help. The Intrepid was rebuilt, but it was never the same. Its hull bore the scars of that battle, and the human crew had chosen not to remove those marks. Instead, they kept them as a reminder of what they had sacrificed and what the Valorian people had gained. Every generation of human officers who took command of the destroyer learned the story. They understood that sometimes a single vessel and a crew willing to embrace danger meant more than 1,000 ships that remained safe in harbor. And so the night that had threatened to consume the Valorian civilization became instead a turning point. From the darkness had emerged not just a human warship, but a new alliance. The Terran Collective and the Valorian people stood together as the years passed, facing whatever threats the galaxy presented. They would never be alone again, because they understood now that somewhere among the stars, there was a species willing to fight in the darkness. There was a species that understood that the measure of a civilization was not its safety, but its willingness to reach out and help those in need. Captain Marcus Webb never sought recognition for what he had done. When asked about the battle in later interviews, he spoke not of his own actions, but of his crew. He spoke of the engineers who had pushed his reactors beyond their design specifications. He spoke of the weapons officers who had maintained fire discipline despite impossible odds. He spoke of the shield operators who had redistributed power to the most damaged sections, even as the ship itself was dying. For Webb, the victory belonged to all of them equally, and he would hear no tales that suggested otherwise. Years later, when historians looked back on that pivotal moment, they recognized it as more than just a military victory. It was a moment when one species learned something essential about another. The Valorians learned that humanity possessed a kind of courage that transcended mere physical strength. They possessed the courage to sacrifice for strangers, to stand against overwhelming odds not because victory was certain, but because standing was necessary. And humanity learned something equally important from the Valorians. They learned that there were species in the galaxy worthy of their sacrifice, that not all civilizations were driven by conquest and domination, that there were beings who valued science and peace and learning, and that protecting such species was not a burden but a privilege. In the darkness, when all hope seemed lost, a human warship had emerged. It had not come with promises of easy victory or guarantees of success. It had simply come, at maximum speed, with weapons ready and crew prepared to do what needed to be done. That simple act of faith in the possibility of helping others, that willingness to risk everything for beings barely known, became the foundation upon which a new era of galactic peace was built. And when the Valorians looked at the stars now, they no longer saw them as a place of darkness and threat. They saw them as a place where friends stood watch, where others stood ready to answer when help was needed. They saw humanity, not as a young and reckless species to be feared, but as the kind of light that pushed back darkness. They had learned what it meant to have an ally willing to sacrifice, and they had learned that humanity was exactly such an ally. On the day when all rescue had failed, when darkness had threatened to consume everything, the humans had come. And in coming, they had given the Valorian people something more precious than any military victory. They had given them tomorrow.